The morning Clara Whitfield cooked for the starving cowboy on her porch. She told herself it was nothing more than basic human decency, the kind any God-fearing woman in Dusty Creek, Texas, would have offered a man who looked like he hadn't eaten in 3 days. But by the time he showed up again the next morning, hat in hand and blue eyes full of something she wasn't ready to name, she understood that she had made a terrible, wonderful mistake. It was the spring of 1878, and Dusty Creek sat stubborn and sun-baked along the edges of the Texas panhandle like a man who refused to move off a bar stool. The town wasn't much to look at: a general store run by old Emmett Holt, a sheriff's office that leaned a little to the left, a livery stable, a church with a crooked bell tower, and a scattering of houses that clung to the dry earth like they were afraid the wind might carry them off. But it was home to the people who lived there, and those people had carved out lives from dust and determination in equal measure. Clara had been one of those people for 3 years. She had come to Dusty Creek from Nashville, Tennessee, in the winter of 1875, following her husband Thomas Whitfield, who had decided that the frontier was where a man could make something real of himself. Thomas had been right about the frontier and wrong about himself, as it turned out, because he had taken a fever in the autumn of 1876 and been dead by November, leaving Clara with a small clapboard house at the edge of town, a vegetable garden, a milk cow named Bessie, and a daughter named Rose who had just turned 4 years old at the time of her father's passing, and was now a bright and chattering 7-year-old who had her mother's dark hair and her late father's stubborn green eyes. Clara had done what frontier women did. She had grieved privately and worked publicly. She took in laundry twice a week, sold eggs from the 4 hens she kept in a small coop behind the house, and twice a month she baked pies that she sold to the saloon, because the saloon owner, a broad woman named Mie Delacroix, believed that men spent more money drinking when their bellies were full of something sweet. Clara kept the house, kept the garden, kept Rose fed and clothed and reading from the Bible and from the 2 novels that sat on the shelf beside the fireplace, and she kept herself from thinking too hard about the years stretching out ahead of her. She was 26 years old and she was not unhappy, not exactly. She was something more complicated than unhappy. She was enduring, and enduring had become so practiced and habitual that she had almost stopped noticing the difference between endurance and contentment. Until the morning she found the cowboy. He was not on her porch when she first saw him. He was sitting on the ground beside her fence post, his back against the wood, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his hat tipped over his face as though he were sleeping. He was dressed in trail clothes that had seen better days: a faded blue shirt gone almost gray at the shoulders, canvas trousers worn through at one knee, boots that had walked 1,000 miles and were volunteering for nothing more. He had a bedroll beside him and a saddle sitting in the dirt a few feet away, which meant his horse had either wandered off or had been taken, and neither of those options suggested a man having a good week. Clara stood on her porch with her coffee cup in both hands and studied him for a moment. Rose was still asleep inside. The sun was barely over the horizon. The chickens were making their morning complaints. She could see the way the man's ribs showed against the fabric of his shirt when he breathed. She could see the hollows beneath his cheekbones even from where she stood. She thought about going inside and letting him sleep and pretending she hadn't seen him, which was the sensible thing to do. A woman alone with a child did not invite strange men into her circumstances. But she had been raised by a woman who believed that leaving a hungry man unfed was the kind of sin God kept careful records of, and her mother's voice was louder in her head that morning than her own caution. She went inside and put more cornmeal in the skillet. She fried up 2 eggs she had been saving for Rose's breakfast and supplemented them with a generous portion of cornmeal mush, seasoned with a little salt and the last of the butter she'd been rationing. She poured a 2nd cup of coffee, strong and black, and she carried the whole plate out to the porch with a fork balanced on its edge. She walked to the fence and stood over him for a moment. "Mister," she said. He didn't move. "Mister," she said louder. The hat brim shifted. One eye appeared, blue as the sky over the panhandle in August, and it looked at her with the particular wariness of a man who has slept in a lot of places where being woken up meant trouble. Then he saw the plate. Both eyes appeared. He sat up slowly, and she revised his age upward. She had thought he might be older from the wear on him, but looking at his face now, she thought he was probably close to her own age, maybe a year or two older. 27, 28 at most. He had a week's worth of dark stubble on his jaw and a scar over his left eyebrow that was old and healed, and his hair was the color of dark walnut when it needed a cut. "Morning, ma'am," he said, and his voice was rough from sleep and probably from thirst. But underneath the roughness it was a decent voice, the kind that came from somewhere in the hill country of Texas or maybe the Oklahoma Territory. "You look like you haven't eaten," Clara said, which was not her most elegant sentence, but it was accurate. "Been a few days," he admitted, and there was no self-pity in his voice, just plain fact. She held out the plate through the gap in the fence. He got to his feet. He was taller than she'd expected, a full head taller than she was, and he took the plate with both hands and held it like it was something precious. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, and the sincerity in it was so unadorned that she felt something twist behind her sternum. "I'll work for this. Tell me what needs doing." "Eat first," Clara said. "We can talk after." She went back to the porch and stood there with her coffee while he ate standing at the fence, and she watched without watching, the way women learn to observe without appearing to observe. He ate like a man who was trying not to eat like a starving man, which meant he ate quickly but held the fork carefully and didn't shovel it in, and she respected him for the effort even while she noted that he cleaned the plate in under 4 minutes. He brought the plate back to the fence and held it out to her. "I mean it about the work," he said. "That fence post on the north side of your garden is leaning, and your porch step, the second one, is cracked through. I can fix both of those if you've got nails and a hammer." Clara looked at the fence post and then at the porch step. Both of those things were true. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eli Kane," he said. "Out of Fredericksburg originally, before that a lot of places." "Clara Whitfield," she said. "The nails are in the barn." That was how it started. Eli Kane fixed the fence post and the porch step, and because the morning was young and he was the kind of man who, once he started seeing things that needed fixing, couldn't stop seeing them, he also rehung the barn door that had been dragging in the dirt and split a cord of firewood that had been sitting in rounds waiting for the attention that Clara's arms could not give it at the end of a long day. He did all of this without being asked, quietly and efficiently, and by the time Rose woke up and came padding out to the porch in her cotton shift, rubbing her eyes and demanding to know why there was a man in their yard, Eli Kane was sitting on the newly repaired porch step with his hat off and his dark hair damp from the water he'd drawn from the well to wash his face and hands, and he told Rose good morning in the same plain, sincere way he'd told Clara thank you, and Rose, who was suspicious of most adults and strangers above all, looked at him for a long moment and then said that he could stay if he wanted, which was more invitation than she had extended to anyone since the new preacher had come to town in January and tried to ruffle her hair. Eli had smiled at that. The smile changed his face in a way that Clara noticed and then told herself she hadn't noticed. He left that afternoon. He had found his horse, a rangy gray gelding named Cracker who had pulled a shoe and wandered into a fence 2 miles east, and he had somewhere to be, work somewhere up near Amarillo, though he was vague about the details in a way that Clara assumed meant temporary ranch work, the kind of itinerant labor that kept men like him moving across the panhandle like tumbleweed. He thanked her again at the gate, hat in hand, and she nodded and watched him ride away and told herself firmly that she had done a good thing, and that was the end of it. She set an extra plate for breakfast the next morning purely out of habit. He arrived at 7 o'clock with the sun at his back and his hat in his hand, and he looked considerably better than he had the morning before. He had stopped at the barber in town. She could tell. and the worst of the trail dust had been brushed from his shirt. He was carrying something under his arm, a paper-wrapped parcel which he held out to her at the gate. "Brought a pound of coffee," he said, "from Holt's store. You used yours up on me yesterday." Clara looked at the parcel and then at him. "Mr. Kane," she said. "I know," he said. You were kind to me, Mrs. Whitfield, and I don't have many other ways to return it. If you'd rather I go, I'll go." She stood there in the morning light with the parcel of coffee in her hands and the smell of it coming through the paper, because Emmett Holt stocked the good beans from down south, and she thought about what it was to be kind to someone when the world was largely unkind, and she thought about the empty extra place she'd set at her table without meaning to, and she said, "I made cornbread." That was the second morning. By the end of the first week, it was a routine, though neither of them had agreed to it or spoken about it. Eli Kane showed up every morning at 7 o'clock, sometimes with something from the store, a tin of molasses, a paper of pins, once a small carved wooden horse that he had clearly made himself, and presented to Rose without looking at Clara while he did it. And Clara cooked breakfast and set 3 plates, and the 3 of them ate together at her kitchen table while Rose talked enough for all of them. Eli had gotten temporary work at the Harlan Ranch 3 miles outside of town, which kept him occupied from mid-morning through the afternoon and into the evening. But mornings he was at Clara's gate at 7 o'clock, and she was at the stove. And somewhere in the second week she stopped pretending she didn't set the extra plate on purpose. She learned things about him the way you learn things about people on the frontier, slowly, in pieces, between other things. He was from a family of 3 boys, all raised by a mother who had done it mostly alone after their father was killed in the war between the states when Eli was 8 years old. He had been working cattle since he was 15. He could read better than most men she knew, which surprised her until he mentioned that his mother had insisted on it. And he had a dry, quiet sense of humor that revealed itself rarely and was more satisfying for the rarity. He asked her things too, careful questions, the kind that made room for her to answer or not as she chose. He asked about Rose, about Nashville, about her garden. He never asked about Thomas directly, but one morning she told him anyway, the short, plain version, and he listened without interrupting and at the end said, "I'm sorry." He sounds like a man who meant well, which was such a precisely accurate thing to say that she had to look out the window for a moment. It was me Delacroix, of all people, who first said the word aloud. Clara had brought the twice-monthly pies to the saloon on a Friday afternoon, and me had looked at her with the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent 30 years reading people for a living and said, "I hear you've been feeding that Kane boy every morning." "He works," Clara said. "He fixed my gate hinges last week." "Ma'am," me said, in the tone of someone who was not talking about gate hinges. "He's kind to Rose," Clara added. "Ma'am," me said again. "Me," Clara said. "I'm not saying a word," me said. "I'm just saying that man looks at you the way parched ground looks at rain. That's all I'm saying." Clara went home and stood in her kitchen for a long time, doing nothing, which was not something she usually did. The thing was, she had noticed. She had been noticing and filing it away under the category of things that were not her business or were too complicated to think about. But she had noticed. She had noticed the way Eli Kane looked at her when he thought she was looking at the stove. She had noticed the way he was careful with his words around her, choosing them slowly the way a man choosing boards for a floor tests each one for weakness before he puts his weight on it. She had noticed the way he had brought his own mending to her table one evening, not asking her to do it, just sitting across from her with his needle and thread while she did hers, as though being in the same room was enough, as though that was all he wanted. She had been trying not to think about what she wanted. The crisis, when it came from the direction she least expected, which was how crises usually arrived. In the 3rd week of May, 1878, a man named Darius Hollowell came to Dusty Creek. He was a land agent from Abilene. He said, though there were people in town who had heard the name Hollowell in connection with things that had nothing to do with legitimate land business. He was a thick, well-dressed man in his early 40s, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone he couldn't eventually wear down, and he had an interest in Clara's property. He came to her door on a Wednesday afternoon while Rose was at school and Clara was in the garden. He introduced himself with the elaborate courtesy of a man who does not feel he owes anyone courtesy but performs it as a tool. He told her that her land, the 3 acres attached to her house, was in a position that several interested parties found attractive, situated as it was on the east side of the proposed path for a new rail spur. He named a price. It was not a bad price, but it was not what the land would be worth if the rail spur came through, and Clara knew enough arithmetic to know that. She told him she wasn't interested in selling. He told her to think about it, and the way he said it made the instruction sound less like an invitation and more like a warning. And when he left, she stood in her garden and felt the particular cold dread of a woman who knows that the end of a polite conversation is only the beginning of a longer and less polite one. She told Eli the next morning, over coffee and fried salt pork, because she had gotten into the habit of telling him things, and because the dread had not left her overnight. He listened without interrupting, which she was used to from him. When she finished, he set his coffee cup down and was quiet for a moment. "Hollowell," he said. "I've heard that name. Man in Amarillo told me about a property dispute in Hale County where a fellow named Hollowell kept showing up until the owner either sold or something unfortunate happened to the property. Barn fire. Well went bad." "You think he'd do something like that?" Clara asked. "I think men who want land badly enough believe the land wants to be theirs," Eli said, "and that belief makes them creative." Rose came in from the bedroom, wanting to know if she could bring her friend Patience home from school that afternoon, and the conversation shifted, but Clara saw Eli's eyes stay thoughtful and flat for the rest of breakfast, the way a man's eyes go when he is thinking through a problem from multiple angles. He came back that evening, which was unusual. He came to the front door rather than the gate, and he had with him a man Clara recognized as the county land recorder, a thin man named Archie Prout who smelled of ink and kept his hat on indoors. "Archie can tell you what I found out today," Eli said. Archie told her that the rail spur was not merely proposed, but was actively surveyed and was going through. He told her that the land on the east side of the planned depot, her land, would be worth roughly 4 times what Hollowell had offered her within 2 years. He also told her, quietly and with some discomfort, that Hollowell had already gotten 3 other properties along the spur line by various means, and that the county attorney had been looking into it but had not yet found grounds to act. "You need to make sure your deed is registered clean," Archie said, "and you need to keep your records in order." The way he's done it elsewhere is to find a gap in the paperwork and file a competing claim while the owner doesn't know to look. Clara sat very still through all of this. "Is my deed registered clean?" she asked. "I checked today," Eli said. "It is. Thomas filed it properly in '75 and it transferred to you clean when he passed. You're fine on paper. As long as you keep your taxes current and your records tight," Archie added. After Archie left, Clara and Eli sat on the porch in the cooling evening air, and she looked out at her land, the garden she had tended, the coop, the little barn, the 3 acres of Texas earth that she and Thomas had paid for with the last of their Nashville savings, and she felt something fierce and animal rise up in her chest, the same feeling she imagined the land itself might feel if land could feel anything. "I'm not selling," she said. "I know," Eli said. "I didn't think you were." "He'll try something else," she said. "Probably," Eli said. "But you've got clean title and a county recorder who now knows to flag anything irregular." And he stopped. "And," she said. "And I'm here every morning," he said quietly. "For what that's worth." She looked at him then, sideways in the evening light, and she thought about me Delacroix's voice saying that man looks at you the way parched ground looks at rain. And she thought about the carved wooden horse on Rose's shelf and the pound of coffee and the fence post and 4 weeks of 7 o'clock mornings, and she thought that what it was worth was quite a lot, actually, and she was not sure what to do with that. "It's worth something," she said, which was the most she could say right then. He nodded once, and they sat there until the stars came out. Hollowell came back on a Saturday, 3 days later. This time he brought a man with him, a hired hand with the look of someone whose job was to stand beside his employer and make the employer's words feel heavier. He repeated his offer, somewhat higher this time, and when Clara declined again, he let a pause settle between them that was meant to feel like a threat without technically being one. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "you're a woman alone on this property. Surely you've thought about the practicalities." "I've thought about them extensively," Clara said. The answer is still no. She was aware, as she stood in her doorway, that Eli's gray gelding was tied to her fence post. She had not planned it that way. He had come by to return a pie tin from me that she had asked him to collect, but she saw Hollowell's eyes go to the horse and then flicker, just slightly, in a way that recalibrated his read of the situation. After they left, Eli came out from the barn where he had been repairing a hinge and looked at her. "Heard most of it," he said. "He's not going to stop," Clara said. "No," Eli agreed. "But he's also not going to do anything stupid as long as he thinks there's a man on the property." Clara opened her mouth and then closed it. She was not a woman who liked needing anyone. She had worked very hard not to need anyone for 3 years. But there was needing because you were weak and needing because you were outnumbered, and the two things were different, and she was not confused about which this was. "Sheriff Beale should know about this," she said. "I already talked to Beale this morning," Eli said. "He's aware." She looked at him. "You talked to Beale?" "I had some time before breakfast," Eli said, with the mildly undefended look of a man who has done something he isn't sure he had the right to do. She thought about being irritated by that. She thought about it for a moment and then let it go. Because irritation required a kind of energy she didn't have to spare on something that was actually not irritating at all. "Thank you," she said. The following Tuesday, Hollowell's man, the hired one, was caught by Sheriff Beale in the act of pulling up one of Clara's fence markers at the property line, which was the kind of preliminary step someone takes before filing a boundary dispute. Beale arrested him for trespassing. Hollowell himself left Dusty Creek the following day, though his departure felt less like defeat and more like the tactical retreat of a man who had other irons in other fires, and had decided this particular iron wasn't worth the trouble. The county attorney wrote it all down. Clara kept the letter. By the time Hollowell was gone, something between Clara and Eli Kane had shifted in a way that could not entirely be attributed to gratitude, because gratitude was a clean and simple emotion, and what Clara was feeling about Eli Kane, by the beginning of June 1878, was not clean or simple. It was the kind of thing she noticed in small ways. The way she found herself listening for the sound of Cracker's hooves on the morning road before the clock said 7. The way she had started putting an extra pinch of the good cinnamon in the morning biscuits without consciously deciding to do it. The way she had mended the tear in his spare shirt. He'd left it on the porch step wrapped in brown paper with a note asking if she might know anyone who could do it, which was such an elaborately polite way of not asking her directly that she had laughed out loud standing at her kitchen table, and then spent more time on the stitching than was strictly necessary for a working shirt. She noticed these things and she thought about Thomas, who had been a good man, a genuinely good man, even if he had perhaps not been entirely the right man, a distinction she had not had the distance to make while he was alive but which she could make now, from the safe perspective of 2 years. She had loved Thomas. She believed that. But she had loved him as a young woman loves the first person who asks her to build a life, which is a love made partly of willingness and partly of youth, and she suspected that the thing growing in her chest about Eli Kane was something different, harder and quieter and more particular to him as a person, which was more frightening. Rose had no such ambivalence. Rose adored Eli Kane with the open and non-negotiable adoration that 7-year-olds reserve for animals, certain books, and the few adults who bother to take them seriously. Eli brought her the occasional small thing, a particularly good stone he'd found, a hawk feather, a beeswax candle he'd shaped into a rabbit, and he answered her questions, which were numerous and relentless and on a wide range of topics, with the patience of a man who genuinely found children interesting rather than merely tolerable. He taught her how to identify 3 different kinds of cloud and what each one meant for weather. He taught her to whistle. He helped her build a small fence around the corner of the yard, where she had decided to keep her own garden, a 3-foot patch in which she was attempting to grow carrots. Clara watched all of this from the kitchen window and the porch and the garden, and she cataloged it without admitting she was cataloging it, adding it to the particular account she was keeping in the back of her mind and not looking at directly. It was a Saturday in early June when things changed. The church in Dusty Creek held its summer social on the first Saturday of June each year, a tradition that involved long tables set up in the churchyard, covered dishes brought by every household in the county, music from whoever could be persuaded to bring an instrument, and the particular mixture of genuine community warmth and careful social observation that was the true currency of small frontier towns. Clara had been going to the social every year since she'd arrived in Dusty Creek, and she brought her lemon pound cake, which had a reputation. Rose had been talking about the social for 2 weeks because Patience's older brother was bringing a fiddle. She was in the kitchen that morning, the pound cake already done and cooling on the rack, mixing the batter for the morning biscuits, when Eli arrived and leaned in the doorway in the way he had adopted over the past few weeks of letting himself through the gate and coming around to the kitchen door rather than the front, which was a small domesticity that had established itself without either of them commenting on it. "Social today," he said. "Yes," she said. "You going?" "Rose would never forgive me if we didn't." He was quiet for a moment. She kept her eyes on the biscuit dough. "Would it suit you," he said carefully, "if I walked with you, and Rose—" She stopped mixing. She thought about all the things that meant in a town the size of Dusty Creek, which was to say she thought about people seeing them walk in together and drawing conclusions, and she thought about whether those conclusions would bother her, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that they would not. "Yes," she said, "it would suit me." The silence that followed was different from the silences they usually had, which were comfortable and easy. This one had a kind of electricity in it, a current running through the ordinary kitchen air. "Good," Eli said. "That's good." The social was everything it was supposed to be. Long tables heavy with covered dishes, the smell of brisket and cornbread and competing pie recipes, children running between adult legs, the fiddle player, who turned out to be 16 and quite skilled, setting up in the shade of the large live oak at the corner of the churchyard. Clara and Eli and Rose arrived together, and Mie Delacroix, standing near the lemonade table, caught Clara's eye from across the yard and raised her eyebrows so significantly that Clara had to look away to avoid laughing. It was a good day. That was the simple truth of it. It was a genuinely good day in a way that Clara had almost forgotten days could be. She talked with her neighbors. She watched Rose drag Eli to see Patience's rabbit hutch, and watched him crouch down to look at the rabbits with the same earnest attention he gave everything Rose considered important. She ate brisket and someone's excellent potato salad, and a piece of her own pound cake, because, by the time she got to it, only 2 slices were left and she had earned 1. In the late afternoon, when the heat was beginning to soften at the edges, and the fiddle player had been joined by a man with a guitar, people started dancing on the flat stretch of grass beside the churchyard. Nothing formal, just couples and groups moving to the music in the comfortable way of people who have danced together before at previous socials and harvests and weddings. Eli was standing beside her watching Rose attempt to teach her friend Patience a dance she had largely invented, and Clara was watching the dancers without thinking about anything in particular. And then Eli turned to her and held out his hand with the same straightforward manner he did everything. "Would you dance with me?" he asked, She looked at his hand, she looked at him. "I haven't danced in a while," she said. "Neither have I," he said. "We can manage badly together." She took his hand. They did not manage badly. It was a simple two-step, the kind everyone on the frontier had learned by necessity. And after the first half-minute of careful distance, they found a rhythm that was easy and natural. And Clara became aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist, and the warmth of his hand holding hers, and the way he was looking at her, which was the way Me had described, and which she now could not pretend she hadn't noticed because she was in the middle of it. "Clara," he said, low enough that it was just between them. "Eli," she said, which was the first time she had used his first name, and she felt it in her chest when she said it, the particular weight of a name belonging to a person who mattered. He didn't say anything else right then, just looked at her with those blue eyes, and she looked back, and the music went on around them, and Rose was somewhere behind her laughing at something, and the evening light came golden through the live oak and lay across the churchyard like a blessing. She thought that she was not enduring at all in that moment. She thought she was something else entirely, something she had not been in a long time. It was 3 days later that Eli told her about the job offer. He told her over breakfast, and she could tell from the careful way he held his coffee cup that he had been thinking about how to say it, which meant he had known about it for at least a day already. The Mercer cattle operation, up near the New Mexico territory line, was looking for a trail boss for their summer drive. It was good money, better than the Harlan Ranch work, and it was the kind of position that could turn into something permanent if the drive went well. "When?" Clara asked. "They'd want me to leave the 1st of July, he said. "Drive's about 10 weeks, back by mid-September." She said nothing for a moment. Rose was outside with the chickens. The morning light came through the kitchen window. "That's a good opportunity," Clara said, and she meant it, which did not mean it didn't feel like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward in all directions. "It is," he said. "I've been working temporary since last fall. This could be something more stable." He looked at her across the table and she looked back, and neither of them said what was in the room with them, which was that they had built something over these 6 weeks that had weight and substance, and that 10 weeks of absence had the capacity to disturb in ways that were difficult to predict. "You should go," Clara said. "Clara, Eli," she stopped. She looked at her coffee. "I'm not going to tell you to stay for my convenience. You have a life to build. You should go." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower and more deliberate. "When I come back," he said, "I'd like to talk to you about something, if you're willing." She looked up at him. "About what?" she asked, though she was fairly certain she knew. "About whether you might be willing to let this be something," he said. "This, us, whatever this is. I know it's not the right time to say that before I leave, and I know you're not the kind of person who wants promises made on the way out the door. But I want you to know that I'm coming back, and I want you to know why." Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about the ways things could go wrong between a man leaving and a man returning, the distance and the silence and the way the heart protects itself by cooling. She thought about how she had been careful for 3 years and what that carefulness had cost her and what it had saved her, and whether the calculation still made the same sense it once had. "When you come back," she said, "we can talk." He nodded. He did not smile exactly, but something settled in his face, some tension releasing, and he picked up his coffee cup, and they finished breakfast with Rose coming in from the chickens with an egg in each hand and demanding to know why nobody had told her breakfast was ready. He left on the 1st of July. He saddled Cracker in her yard that morning because his bedroll and saddle bags had been stored in her barn for the past several weeks, and Rose stood on the porch and watched with her arms crossed in the way she stood when she was trying not to show she was sad. Eli came to say goodbye to Rose first, crouching down to her level on the porch step. "I'll be back in September," he said. "And I'll bring you something from New Mexico territory." "A turquoise stone," Rose said immediately. "Patience has one and she says they're everywhere in New Mexico." "Turquoise stone it is," Eli said. He straightened up and looked at Clara, and there were a lot of things in that look that neither of them put into words because the morning was public and Rose was watching, and words would have made things too large and too fragile all at once. "Take care of yourself," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was a ghost of the smile she had come to know in it. He swung up onto Cracker and rode down the morning road, and Clara watched him go with her arms at her sides, and Rose slipped a hand into hers, and they stood there together until the gray horse and the man on it rounded the bend by the Miller place and were gone. July was long. Clara told herself it was long because summer on the Panhandle was always long, the heat pressing down on everything and making the days thick and slow. She told herself it had nothing to do with the absence of 7 o'clock footsteps on the morning road. She kept busy, which was not difficult because there was always more to be done than there were hours for doing it. She tended the garden through the fierce July heat, carrying water in the cool of the morning and evening. She sold her eggs and her laundry and her pies. She patched Rose's cotton dresses where they had worn at the knees and elbows from an entire summer of being a child in the dirt. She attended church and the Tuesday sewing circle at Mie Delacroix's house, and she read, slowly and carefully, the second of the 2 novels from the shelf by the fireplace, a copy of Jane Eyre that she had read before but that held more resonance now than it had on the first reading. She received 1 letter from Eli, forwarded through the Mercer Operations postal contact in Amarillo, written in a plain hand on a single sheet of paper. It said, "Clara, drive going well. Country between here and the territory is big in the way that makes a man feel small without making him feel bad about it. Hope the garden is doing well. Tell Rose the turquoise is secured." Kane, she read it 3 times and then put it in the box on the shelf where she kept Thomas's letters from before they were married and her mother's letters from Nashville and Rose's first drawing, which was a figure with an enormous head that Rose had identified as a horse. She wrote back, "Mr. Kane, garden is surviving the heat. Rose asks me to report that Patience's rabbit had 4 babies, one of which Rose has named Cracker. She says you should feel honored. The carrots are coming up. See Whitfield." She sent it to the Mercer postal contact and thought about it no more, which was not true at all. August brought a complication she had not expected. Thomas's brother, a man named William Whitfield, arrived in Dusty Creek in the 3rd week of August. William was 3 years older than Thomas had been, a solid, respectable man who worked in mercantile goods and was, as far as Clara knew, perfectly decent. He was also unmarried, which she had known but not thought about, and the reason he had come to Dusty Creek became clear within the first hour of his arrival. He came to her door with a good suit and a careful expression, and a story about how he had always felt a responsibility to his late brother's family, which unrolled gradually and with increasing specificity into a proposal. He was not cruel about it. He was, in fact, fairly thoughtful about it, acknowledging that it was unexpected and that she might need time to consider it. But the bones of it were that he was a man with steady income, and she was a widow with a child and a property under some degree of threat from land agents. And did it not make practical sense? Clara listened to all of it with the patience she had cultivated across 3 years of doing difficult things. "William," she said when he finished, "I appreciate that you mean this kindly." "But," he said, "but I'm not going to marry someone out of practicality," she said. "Thomas meant more to me than a practical arrangement, and I mean more to myself than one." William looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. "Is there someone else?" he asked. She had been wondering the same thing, in the way that you wonder about a thing you already know the answer to but have not yet said aloud. "I think there might be," she said. William left the next morning, not unkindly, and promised to write when he was home. He kept that promise, a brief and dignified letter that arrived 6 weeks later and which she answered with equal dignity. September came slowly and then all at once, the way months do when you are waiting for something at the end of them. Clara told herself she was not counting days and then stopped pretending, because pretending had become too much work. It was the 14th of September, a Thursday, when she heard Cracker's hooves on the morning road. She was at the stove. She was making biscuits, which she told herself had nothing to do with anything, because she made biscuits every Thursday morning. She heard the hoofbeats and she put down the bowl, and she did not go to the window and look, because she was not going to be a woman standing at a window watching the road, which was what she very much wanted to do. She heard the gate. She heard footsteps on the porch. She heard the knock on the kitchen door frame, which was how he always announced himself. She turned around. He looked good, trail-lean and sundark and tired in the specific way of a long drive well completed. He was wearing a clean shirt, which meant he'd stopped at the barber again, and he had his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her at the church social in the evening light. "I told you I'd be back," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant what I said before I left," he said. "About wanting to talk." "I know that too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him steadying himself, the way she had watched him steady himself for difficult tasks, with that same quiet gathering of intention. "Clara," he said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the third morning I sat at your kitchen table. I know that might be alarming to hear. I know you're a practical woman and you've built something here and you don't need a man to come along and complicate it. But I would rather say it plainly than not say it and have you not know." The kitchen was very still. She thought about 3 years of enduring and the way enduring had not been the same as living. She thought about the church social and his hand at her waist. She thought about the letter in the box on the shelf. She thought about Rose standing on the porch that July morning with her arms crossed trying not to show she was sad. She thought about the extra place she'd set at the table before she'd admitted she was setting it. "Eli," she said. "Yes. You should probably come in," she said. "The biscuits are going to burn." He came in. He sat at the table. She put the biscuits in the oven and turned around, and he was looking at her with an expression that was very careful and very unguarded at the same time. And she crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and said, "I think I have been in love with you since you told me the fence post was leaning, and I'm not alarmed by it at all." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, and he was not a man who moved without thought, so the quickness of it told her something. And then his hands were at her face, careful and unhesitating at once, and he kissed her in the morning kitchen light, and it was not tentative or questioning but whole and certain, the way something becomes when two people have been slowly building toward it for months, and the building is finally done. Rose found them in the kitchen when she came in for breakfast, her mother at the stove with pink in her cheeks, and Eli Kane sitting at the table looking like the sun had come up inside him. And Rose looked between the two of them with the sharp eyes of a 7-year-old who had been paying attention all along. "Did you bring my turquoise stone?" she asked Eli. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a piece of blue-green stone the size of a robin's egg, smooth on one side and rough on the other. Rose took it and examined it with great seriousness. "You can stay," she announced, and went to get her plate. Clara looked at Eli over Rose's head and laughed, and he laughed too, and the sound of it in the kitchen was something Clara tucked away and kept. The weeks that followed were different from the weeks before. Not in the mechanics. Eli still came to breakfast every morning, still worked at the Harlan Ranch during the day, still fixed things and chopped wood and sat on the porch in the evening. But in the quality of everything, as though the same ordinary days had been lit from a different angle. They talked more in the mornings, longer and deeper, the way people talk when they have stopped being careful with each other. They talked about the land and what it might become. They talked about Rose and her education, and whether the schoolteacher in Dusty Creek was adequate to the scope of Rose's ambitions, which were large and various and included, at different moments, being a doctor, a librarian, and a person who studied birds professionally. They talked about what Eli wanted to do with his life beyond ranch work and trail drives, and he talked about it slowly, and with some difficulty, the way people talk about things they have wanted for a long time but have not said aloud much. He wanted to have his own place, he said, his own land. Not a big spread, just enough to run a small herd of cattle and maybe grow something, in a part of the country that felt like it was worth putting roots into. He looked at her when he said it, and she looked at him, and neither of them said the thing that was obvious, but neither of them missed it either. It was in October, on a Tuesday evening, that he asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. That was not who he was. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the October evening cool enough for a shawl, Rose inside doing her arithmetic at the kitchen table, the stars coming out over the panhandle sky in the clear, thick way they came out in autumn, and Eli said, "I've been thinking about what I want. I told you about the land, but the land is, I mean, without—" He stopped and started again. "Clara," he said, "I want to do this with you, all of it. The land, the morning, the kitchen, Rose, you, if you'd have me." She looked at the stars for a moment. She thought about William Whitfield and the word practicality and how she had refused it, and she thought about how this was not practicality at all. This was something that had come up through her like a root, slow and strong and entirely without her planning it. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat there watching the stars, and she thought that this was what contentment actually felt like, as distinct from endurance, and the difference was larger than she had expected. They were married in the church in Dusty Creek on the last Saturday of November, 1878. It was a small wedding, the way frontier weddings were, the preacher with the crooked bell tower, Me Delacroix in her best dress with her eyes suspiciously bright, Archie Pruitt and his wife, the Harlan family from the ranch, Rose in a new white dress that Clara had made from fabric she had been saving without knowing why she was saving it, and Eli in a suit he had bought in Amarillo on the way back from the cattle drive, dark wool, well cut, which he wore with the same straightforward dignity he wore everything. The preacher said the words and Clara and Eli said theirs, and when Eli put the ring on her finger, a thin gold band he had ordered through Emmett Holt's store, simple and plain and exactly right. He said his vows looking at her with absolute directness, no performance in it, just the steady attention of a man who meant every syllable he was saying. They walked out of the church into the November sunlight as husband and wife, and Rose held both their hands at once, walking between them, which was not planned or instructed, but which was perfectly right. Me Delacroix organized a small celebration at the saloon, the back room, which she used for community gatherings and which smelled of good food rather than whiskey. And there was music and dancing, and Clara ate a piece of her own wedding cake, which Me had made, and which was a white cake with lemon filling that tasted like something from a restaurant in Nashville, which was to say like something better than anything this part of Texas had any right to produce. She danced with Eli 3 times, which by Dusty Creek social standards was a declaration approaching scandal, and she did not care in the slightest. They moved into the house together, which required some adjustment, because Eli's belongings were minimal but his presence was not, and there was a period of negotiating the spaces of a house that had been organized around 1 adult woman and 1 small child, and was now organized around 2 adults and 1 small child, and all the negotiations that entailed. It was not always smooth. They were 2 strong-willed people with established habits, and the first time they had a real argument over whether to sell the east pasture at the price the new land buyer was offering, which Clara thought was reasonable and Eli thought was premature. They were both stiff and careful for a full day afterward, moving around each other like ships giving each other a wide berth. But they talked it through, that evening, on the porch with the November cold pressing at their backs and the light coming yellow from the kitchen window, and they reached a conclusion that was neither of their original positions but better than either, which was to hold the land for 1 more year and see what the rail spur did to prices. And the argument resolved itself into something more interesting than either of them had expected, which was a genuine sense of being in partnership with someone who thought differently enough to improve your thinking. Clara noticed, after that first argument, that she trusted him more. That seemed counterintuitive but was not. You couldn't know the shape of someone's integrity until you'd seen it under pressure, and she had seen his, and it was what she'd thought it was. He was good with Rose, not in the way of a man performing goodness for an audience, but in the quiet, consistent way of someone who genuinely liked the child and was interested in her as a person. He continued the arithmetic he had started, adding to it some basic geometry because Rose had expressed an interest in understanding how buildings were made. He brought her books when he could find them, a natural history, a book about birds that made Rose so happy she carried it around for 2 weeks, and he listened to her talk about patience in school and the rabbits and the progress of the carrots with the same attention he gave to everything. Rose, for her part, stopped calling him Mr. Kane in December and started calling him Eli, which was her decision entirely, and which she announced one morning over breakfast as a simple statement of fact. Eli received this with a gravity appropriate to the significance of the moment and passed her the butter. Winter on the Panhandle was hard and beautiful in equal measure, the cold coming down from the north in waves, and the sky going that particular deep winter blue that made the land look like something from a painting. Clara kept the house warm and the garden covered and the hens laying, and Eli kept the stock fed and the wood split and the pipes from freezing, and they did the work of winter together, which is different from doing it alone in ways that go beyond the mere division of labor. In the evenings they read. This was something that Clara had told him she liked to do, and he had said he liked it too, and they had discovered that reading in the same room had a particular quality of companionship, each of them in their own world but the worlds running parallel, and sometimes one of them would read something aloud that seemed worth saying aloud, and the other would listen, and sometimes that led to conversation, and sometimes it didn't. He told her more about his mother in the winter evenings, about growing up in Fredericksburg with 2 brothers, and a woman who refused to let poverty become illiteracy or hardship become meanness. His mother had died in 1873 of a lung ailment, and he had been away when it happened, on a cattle drive in Kansas, and he had gotten the news 2 weeks late by letter, which was the kind of grief that left a particular kind of mark. Clara listened to this without trying to smooth it over, which was what she had learned he needed, not comfort exactly but witness, the sense of being heard without being managed. She told him things in return. About Nashville and her family and her mother, who was still living and who received a letter every month and who had written back, upon hearing of Clara's remarriage, a letter of such warm and careful happiness that Clara had cried over it at the kitchen table in a way that Eli had noticed and not commented on, only brought her coffee and sat across from her until she was done. By spring of 1879, the house on the east side of Dusty Creek had become, unmistakably and entirely, a home. The first morning of April, Clara stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, which was waking up again after winter, the green pushing through the turned earth, and she felt something she had been noticing for a few weeks without saying anything about it, a particular awareness of her body, a certain morning heaviness, a shift in how certain smells hit her, and she thought about the calendar and did the arithmetic that women on the frontier knew how to do. She told Eli on a Sunday morning, after Rose had gone to church with Patience's family, while the 2 of them were still at the breakfast table with their second cups of coffee. She said, "I think I'm going to have a baby." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds, which was how long it took Eli to put down his coffee cup and stand up and come around the table and take both of her hands in both of his. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but very close to entirely." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see everything moving through him, the happiness, the fear, the weight of it, the sheer living reality of it, and then he said very quietly, "Clara." "I know," she said. He put his arms around her and she let him, resting her head against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen in the April morning light, and she thought that she had been afraid for a moment to tell him, not because she thought he would be unhappy but because happiness was its own kind of vulnerability, and she had spent a long time being careful with her own heart. But it was fine. It was better than fine. She could feel it in the way he held her, the certainty and the care in it, the sense of a man holding something he intends to keep safe. Rose's reaction, when told that evening, was a complex negotiation that involved a period of silent thought followed by a series of practical questions about sleeping arrangements, and then a decision that she was in favor of it as long as the baby understood that the room was hers. Eli solemnly promised to communicate this to the baby at the earliest opportunity, and Rose said that was acceptable. The pregnancy was, for the most part, straightforward. Clara was tired in ways she had not been tired with Rose, but she was also older and more knowing, and she was not doing it alone this time, which made a difference that went beyond the practical. Eli was attentive without being anxious, careful without being hovering, and he took on the heavier work of the property through the summer without being asked or thanked, because he was not a man who needed to be thanked for doing what needed doing. They had the Hollowell matter finally, completely, settled in June of 1879, when the county attorney wrote to inform Clara that Darius Hollowell had been found liable in a civil suit brought by two of the other property owners along the rail spur line, and had been ordered to pay significant damages and to vacate his competing claims to the land. The letter also noted that the rail spur itself was confirmed to pass through the east side of Dusty Creek, which meant that Clara's 3 acres had become, as Archie Pruitt had predicted, considerably more valuable than it had been the morning Hollowell first knocked on her door. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table and then passed it to Eli without comment. He read it and set it down and said, "Well, well," she agreed. "You held the land," he said. "We held the land," she said. He looked at her and smiled, and she smiled back, and they finished their coffee. The baby came in December of 1879, in the same bedroom where Clara had slept since 1875, attended by the town's midwife, a steady German woman named Mrs. Hecker, who had delivered what seemed like half the children in the county, and had strong opinions about the proper temperature of the room and the uselessness of husbands during labor. Which last opinion Clara shared by the end of the second hour and communicated to Eli through the closed bedroom door by way of Mrs. Hecker. He was a boy, 8 pounds, healthy and loud about it from the first moment, with a shock of dark hair that matched both his parents and blue eyes that Mrs. Hecker said would probably change but which stayed blue. Eli came in when Mrs. Hecker permitted it, which was after Clara had been cleaned up and the baby wrapped, and the room brought to a temperature Mrs. Hecker found acceptable, and he came in quietly and looked at his son in Clara's arms with an expression that Clara had never seen on his face before, a complete and undefended openness, like a room with all the windows thrown wide. "He's something," Eli said, which was not his most eloquent moment, and they both knew it, and neither of them cared. "Come hold him," Clara said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she transferred the baby to his arms with the careful confidence of a woman who had done this before, and watched her husband hold their son for the first time with the particular careful intensity of a man who has not held many babies and is very serious about doing it correctly. "What do we call him?" Eli asked, looking at the baby. "I was thinking James," Clara said. "After your mother's name. Your mother was James, wasn't she?" Eli looked at her. His mother's name had been Jane. He understood what she was doing. "James," he said, trying it. "James Kane." "If you like it," Clara said. "I like it," he said. Rose came in a few minutes later, dragging her nightgown, unable to sleep despite the late hour, and she looked at the baby in her father's arms with the same complex internal negotiation she brought to all significant developments. "He's very small," she said. "He'll grow," Eli said. "Does he know that the room is mine?" Rose asked. "We've discussed it thoroughly," Eli said. Rose nodded, satisfied. She climbed onto the bed on the other side of Clara and looked at her brother from a safe observational distance, and then she reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers, with the absolute unconscious instinct of a newborn, curled around her finger and held on. Rose looked at this for a moment. Something shifted in her face, the negotiation concluding in favor of the small person who had just, without any apparent effort, made himself necessary. "He can stay," she said. Clara looked at Eli over Rose's head, the same look they had exchanged at breakfast the morning Rose had said the same thing about him, and Eli looked back at her with the smile she had come to know better than anything in the world, the rare one that changed his face. The years that followed were the years of building. Eli took the money from the East pasture, sold in the spring of 1880 at the price they'd been waiting for, 4 times what they'd been offered 2 years earlier, and put it toward a proper cattle operation. Not large, as he'd always said he wanted, but solid and well managed. A small herd of quality stock that he ran on the expanded property, which grew by 12 acres when the Harlan Ranch broke up in 1881, and Eli was in a position, for the first time, to buy land instead of working it for someone else. Clara kept the house and the garden and the eggs, and, for a while longer, the pies for me's saloon, though she eventually had enough from the cattle operation that the pie money was less necessity and more habit, and me would have been more offended by the absence than the money was worth, so the pies continued. Me Delacroix herself was a constant of the years in Dusty Creek, a woman of inexhaustible pragmatism and unexpected warmth, and she and Clara had the kind of friendship that women form on the frontier, built out of necessity and sustained by genuine regard, the kind where you can be silent together or speak difficult truths and neither requires apology. Rose grew into the person she had always indicated she would be, formidably intelligent, opinionated, devoted to her books, and capable of a stubbornness that was entirely recognizable from both parents. She attended school in Dusty Creek through the available years, and then, in 1884, when she was 13, Clara and Eli managed a correspondence with an academy in Abilene that agreed to take her on scholarship, based on a set of examinations she completed by mail, and which had impressed the academy's head mistress sufficiently that the head mistress wrote a letter to Clara that used the word exceptional 3 times. The morning Rose left for Abilene was both proud and hard, the way such mornings always are. Clara stood on the porch and watched the stage carry her daughter away from Dusty Creek, and felt the particular tearing of a woman watching the person she loves most in the world become who they are supposed to be, which is always partly away from you. Eli stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and just being there was the thing. James was 4 by the time Rose left for Abilene, a compact and determined child who had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a personality that was all his own. He was not quiet like Eli or focused like Clara, but exuberant and social, the kind of child who befriended everyone within 20 yards and remembered their names and the names of their horses and their dogs. He was also, they discovered, extraordinarily talented with animals in the way that some people simply are, an instinctive understanding that the horses and cattle on the property recognized and responded to, and which by the time he was 7 was making Eli considerably more efficient at moving cattle around the property than he had been without the boy's inexplicable assistance. In the spring of 1885, Clara found herself in the early weeks of a second pregnancy, which she discovered 3 years after a miscarriage in the fall of 1882 that had been quietly devastating and quietly survived, the way frontier women survived difficult things, by continuing to do the next necessary task. The miscarriage was something she and Eli had mourned together in the way that grief shared is different from grief alone, neither of them pretending it was fine or small or easily recovered from, and the recovery had been slow and had added something to their marriage that was not visible from the outside, but that both of them felt, a kind of depth that comes from having stood together in a dark place and not let go. This pregnancy was careful, and was watched over by both of them with more attention than Clara had given to James's, and Mrs. Hecker, now a figure of unquestionable authority in the county, declared in July of 1885 that everything was proceeding as it should, which was as reassuring as Mrs. Hecker got. The baby was a girl, born in October of 1885, small and squalling and perfect. They named her Jane, for Eli's mother. Eli held her in the same room where he had held James, on the edge of the same bed, with the same quality of absolute attention. And Clara watched him and thought about a man sitting against a fence post on a spring morning in 1878, hollow-cheeked and hungry, the kind of tired that goes deeper than the body, and how much had grown from that single act of ordinary human kindness, a plate of food carried to a stranger, an extra place set at a table. It had grown into this. This house, these children, this man holding their daughter in the October evening light. It had grown into years of mornings at the kitchen table and evenings on the porch and arguments resolved on cold November nights and Rose's voice reading, aloud from her bird book, and James's laugh carrying from the yard and the garden turning over every spring and the cattle in the east pasture, and the rail spur that had brought prosperity to the east side of Dusty Creek, and that she had held the land for. And all of it, every corner and acre and morning of it, had started with pity. Plain and simple, the kind of pity that becomes generosity when you stop being afraid of it. Rose came home from Abilene for Christmas of 1885 and met her new sister and held her with the careful confidence of a girl who had spent Christmas vacations for 2 years discussing medicine with the Academy's science instructor, and was now firmly committed to the idea of studying to be a physician, which was not an uncomplicated ambition for a young woman in 1885, and which Clara and Eli had spent some private conversations discussing. Not to discourage it, but to understand how to help it along. There was a women's medical college in Philadelphia that had been accepting students since before the war. Eli had written to them in the fall, a letter that Clara did not know about until Rose was home for Christmas, and Eli produced the response at the dinner table and told his stepdaughter that he had been in correspondence with the admissions office, and that the college was interested, and that they would need to correspond further, but that the path was there if she wanted to walk it. Rose looked at the letter for a long moment. She looked at Eli. "You did this on your own," she said. "Your mother looked it over before I sent the letter," Eli said. "But yes, mostly." Rose looked at her mother. "He has been planning this since September," Clara said. "I told him you would not want a fuss about it, and he said he wasn't making a fuss, he was just writing a letter." Rose pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was managing strong feeling, which she had learned from her mother. "Thank you," she said to Eli. "Both of you." "You're the one who has to do it," Eli said. "We just need to make sure the doors are open." Rose nodded once with great composure, and then she looked at the letter again, and the composure bent just slightly, and Clara reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, and the 4 of them, or 5, if you counted baby Jane in her cradle by the fire, sat around the dinner table in the house on the east side of Dusty Creek, and the evening was warm and the food was good, and outside the December cold lay across the panhandle like a blanket. And Clara thought that this was the life she had built. Not alone, but alongside someone, and that the word alongside was the important one. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Rose in her old room with the new smell of a college girl's books, James sacked out in his with the complete unconsciousness of an 8-year-old Jane peaceful in her cradle. Clara and Eli sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low and the last of the coffee going cold between them. "She'll go to Philadelphia," Clara said. It was not a question. "She'll go," Eli agreed. "And then she'll be a doctor," Clara said. "Of course she will," Eli said, in the tone of a man who has never had any doubt about this and does not understand why anyone would. Clara looked at him across the table. This man who had been hungry at her fence post 7 years ago and had come back the next morning with a pound of coffee. This man who had fixed her fence post and her porch step, and in ways she had not asked for and could not have anticipated, the particular crack in the life she had been managing so carefully alone. "Eli," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "I'm glad I cooked for you," she said. He understood what she meant. She could see it in his face, the way it moved, the particular warmth of a man remembering something that mattered. "I'm glad you did too," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and held it there in the lamplight, and the house was quiet around them, full of the particular quality of quiet that comes not from emptiness but from completeness, from all the things being in their right places. Outside, the winter stars over the Texas Panhandle were out in their full December force, brilliant and cold and immeasurable, the same stars that had looked down on this country for 10,000 years before a small town called Dusty Creek existed beneath them, before a woman named Clara had stood on her porch with a coffee cup and made a decision that was not a decision at all, just the most ordinary kindness in the world, given without expectation, and received in a way that changed everything. The Kane Ranch, as it came to be known, grew steadily through the 1880s. Not dramatically, not in the way of the big cattle barons up north, but honestly and well, the kind of growth that comes from good management and better judgment, and the consistent presence of people who know what they are doing and care about doing it right. James Kane, who had shown such extraordinary talent with animals since before he could reliably tie his own boots, was working the herd full-time by 15, and managing significant portions of the operation by 17. His father's steady practical intelligence, combined with his own instinctive understanding of cattle and horses, and the land they ran on. Jane grew into a child of such serene confidence that her parents sometimes looked at each other in mild bewilderment, as though wondering how they had produced someone so settled in herself. She had Eli's quiet and Clara's perception, and something entirely her own, a particular stillness that drew people to her, the way water draws people in dry country. She had, by the time she was old enough to have opinions, a talent for drawing that she exercised on everything within reach: the cattle, the house, the garden, the faces of her family rendered in charcoal with an accuracy that was slightly unnerving in a 10-year-old. Rose did go to Philadelphia. She left in the autumn of 1887, 19 years old, with a trunk full of books and clothes and the small turquoise stone that she had kept on her shelf since 1878, and she enrolled in the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and wrote home every month with a combination of clinical observation and barely concealed wonder that made Clara's heart ache with love and pride in alternating waves. She also wrote about a young man named Dr. Marcus Webb, an instructor at the college's affiliated hospital, who she mentioned first in passing in a letter from her second semester, then with more detail, then with a frequency that told Clara everything she needed to know before Rose ever said anything directly. Marcus Webb was, it emerged, 24 years old to Rose's 20, and had a mother in Ohio and an ambition to practice on the frontier, which Rose had mentioned to him in passing, and which had apparently contributed to a series of conversations that had become central to both their lives. Clara read these letters to Eli on the porch in the evenings, as she had read all of Rose's letters, and when Marcus Webb began to appear with increasing frequency, Eli looked at her over the lamp with an expression of gentle amusement. "She said something like this to me once," Clara told him. "What did she say?" "That she could tell when a person mattered to someone," Clara said, "from how often they said the name." Eli considered this. "Smart child," he said. "Always was," Clara said. Rose married Marcus Webb in the summer of 1890 in a ceremony in Dusty Creek. She had insisted on Dusty Creek, which was home, which was where Me Delacroix sat in the front row of the church and cried without apology, which was where the live oak in the churchyard was full of summer birds, which was where Clara and Eli and James and Jane stood on the church steps in the June sunlight and watched Rose become Mrs. Webb with the composed happiness of a woman who has arrived at exactly where she intended to be. Marcus Webb was a good man. Quiet, precise, kind in the specific way of someone who has chosen a profession whose entire purpose is the alleviation of suffering. He looked at Rose the way Rose deserved to be looked at, which was as the most interesting person in any room, and Rose looked at him with the same regard. And Clara thought, watching them, that Rose had done what she herself had done, found someone who met her at the level of who she actually was rather than who it was convenient for her to be. The Webbs settled, after Marcus's hospital training was complete, in Abilene, where they opened a medical practice together, Rose having completed her degree in 1891, with the kind of distinction that the head mistress of the Abilene Academy would have found entirely predictable. Their first child, a boy named Thomas after his grandfather, was born in 1892 and was carried to Dusty Creek to meet his grandparents at 6 weeks old, and was held by Eli Kane in much the same way Eli had held his own children, with that absolute serious attention, and the baby apparently approved because he went to sleep. Clara stood in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 17 years and watched her husband hold her daughter's son, and thought about the morning of 1878, with the clarity that comes when enough time has passed for things to come into their full shape. She thought about standing on the porch with her coffee cup and looking at the man against the fence post and deciding that her mother's voice was right. She thought about the plate of food carried to the fence. She thought about the next morning, 7 o'clock, hat in hand, a pound of coffee under his arm. He had showed up every morning after that. He had been showing up every morning for 12 years. He would, she had no doubt at all, keep showing up every morning for every morning they had left, which she intended to be a great many. Miss Delacroix came to visit that afternoon, as she had been coming to visit for 12 years, and held the baby and declared him a fine specimen, and drank Clara's coffee, and told Eli that the new steer in the east pasture had gotten through the fence again, and was eating Archie Prute's wife's garden, which Eli said he would attend to immediately, which he did, and came back with mud on his boots and the somewhat sheepish expression of a man whose steer has eaten an innocent woman's cabbages. James came in from the day's work shortly after, 21 years old and already with the look of a man the land had agreed to take seriously, and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked cattle with his father, and bounced his nephew on his knee and told Rose. She looked tired and received from Rose a sharp clinical assessment of his own complexion that made everyone at the table laugh. Jane, 14 and already filling her third sketchbook, sat in the corner by the window and drew everything that was happening, the kitchen and the people in it, the late afternoon light coming through the glass, the baby asleep on Eli's shoulder, Clara at the stove, Miss Delacroix with her coffee cup, Rose and Marcus side by side at the table, James with his hat pushed back on his head. When the house was quieter later, Clara looked at what Jane had drawn and felt something move through her that she did not have a word for, or rather, she had many words for it, and none of them were quite right. The drawing showed the kitchen in the particular light of that afternoon, the people in their places, the fire and the grate, the shelves with the books and the tin canisters and the small things accumulated over years. It looked like home. It looked exactly like home. She found Eli on the porch after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, and the house had settled into its evening quiet, and she stood beside him in the October cool and looked out at the property, the garden, the barn, the east pasture, where the steer had been retrieved from Archie Prute's wife's cabbages, the land that went out to the horizon under the enormous Texas sky. "I keep thinking about that first morning," she said. He looked at her. "I was so certain I was doing something careful," she said. "Just one meal, just a practical thing, because it was the right thing to do." "It was the right thing to do," he said. "I know," she said. "I just didn't expect it to be everything." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch in the evening the way they had stood on so many evenings, in all the seasons of 12 years, and she thought about how the best things in a life are almost never the things you planned, almost never the things you were careful about, almost never the things that arrived announced. They are the things you did without thinking, out of ordinary human decency, and which then, quietly and persistently, day after day, 7 o'clock at the gate, showed up and became your whole life. She was grateful for every morning of it. The wind moved across the panhandle in the October dark, carrying the smell of the season turning, the particular sharp sweetness of autumn on the Texas plain, and somewhere in the east pasture a steer lowed once, presumably an apology for the cabbage incident. And James's light was still on in the bunkhouse he'd moved himself into at 18 in the interests of independence. And Jane's lamp was still burning in her room, where she was probably drawing something in the dark that would be better than anything Clara could produce in full daylight. And somewhere in the house, Thomas's grandson was sleeping with the complete trust of a new person in a safe place. Clara looked out at all of it and thought, with a clarity that was the opposite of endurance and the exact heart of contentment, that she would not trade a single morning of this life for any other version of it. Not even the first one, when she had stood on her porch with her coffee cup and made the smallest and most consequential decision of her life, and carried a plate to the fence, and changed everything.